Hey everyone, welcome back. Ready for another deep dive?
Always.
Awesome. So today we're tackling Brené Brown's Daring Greatly. I'm so excited to dig into this one.
Me too. This is a book that really flips the script on how we think about vulnerability.
Yeah, it seems like everyone's talking about it, but to be honest, I wasn't sure what to expect. Like, vulnerability, isn't that kind of a touchy-feely topic?
Well, it can be, sure. But Brown approaches it from a really grounded and practical perspective. It's less about being overly emotional and more about understanding the role vulnerability plays in living a wholehearted life.
Okay, I'm intrigued. So how does she define vulnerability exactly?
For Brown, vulnerability is about being willing to step into uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure.
Hmm. So it's not just about, like, sharing your deepest secrets with everyone.
No, not at all. It's more nuanced than that. Think of it like this. Imagine you're starting a new project at work. You're excited about it, but there's also that little voice in your head saying, what if I mess this up? What if I'm not good enough?
Oh yeah, I know that voice all too well.
Right, so that feeling, that willingness to put yourself out there, even when you don't know the outcome, that's vulnerability.
Okay, I'm starting to see what you mean, but how does that connect to courage? I mean, usually we think of courage as being fearless, right?
Right, but Brown challenges that idea. She argues that true courage comes from showing up authentically, even when we're feeling vulnerable. Think about it. What takes more courage? Pretending to have it all figured out or admitting that you don't know something and asking for help?
That's a good point. I guess most of us are conditioned to try to hide our imperfections, to project this image of having it all together.
Exactly, and that's where the fear of vulnerability comes in. We live in a culture that often equates vulnerability with weakness, so we learn to armor up, to hide those parts of ourselves that we think might make us less worthy or lovable.
It's like we're all walking around in emotional armor, afraid to let anyone see the real us.
And that can be incredibly isolating. We crave connection, but we're terrified of the vulnerability it requires.
Which is probably why shame plays such a big role in daring greatly, right?
Absolutely. Shame thrives in secrecy and silence. It makes us feel like we have to hide the parts of ourselves that we deem unacceptable.
And I remember reading that Brown doesn't just talk about shame, she offers a solution, right? Something called shame resilience.
Exactly. Shame resilience is about developing skills and practices that help us recognize shame, understand its triggers, and move through it in a healthy way.
So it's not about eliminating shame altogether because that's probably impossible, right?
Right. It's more about developing a more compassionate and accepting relationship with ourselves, even when we make mistakes or feel like we fall short.
This is making a lot of sense. So it sounds like shame resilience is kind of like the foundation for embracing vulnerability.
You got it. When we can face shame head on and develop resilience, we're less afraid to let our guard down and be our true selves. And that's when we can really start to experience the power of vulnerability.
I'm ready to hear more about that power. But first, a quick word from our sponsor. We'll be right back. Welcome back. So we've been talking about shame resilience and the importance of embracing vulnerability. But I have to admit, it's a little scary to think about letting my guard down completely. Like, how much vulnerability is too much?
That's a great question. And I think a lot of people struggle with that. Luckily, Brown talks about that too. It's not about like oversharing with everyone you meet.
Right, that wouldn't be healthy.
No, for sure. It's more about being mindful of who you choose to be vulnerable with.
So it's about choosing wisely who to trust.
Exactly. You want to make sure you're sharing with people who have earned that trust, who will respond with empathy and understanding. And actually, this reminds me of that amazing metaphor she uses, stepping into the arena.
Oh yeah, that one stuck with me too. It's so powerful. But I'm still a bit fuzzy on what exactly my arena is.
Well, think of it as any area of your life where you're really going for it, where you're putting your heart and soul into something that matters to you.
Okay. So it could be anything from my career to my creative pursuits, even my relationships.
Exactly. Anything that really lights you up, where you're striving for something meaningful. And here's the key. It's not about seeking validation from others or trying to prove something to the world.
So it's more about being true to yourself and going after what you want, even if it's scary.
You nailed it. It's about aligning your actions with your values, regardless of the outcome. And honestly, that's a pretty radical idea.
It is, especially in a world where we're constantly bombarded with messages about what we should be doing or achieving.
It's so easy to get caught up in that, to measure our worth based on external factors. But Brown encourages us to resist that trap.
Because when we focus on external validation, we give away our power.
Exactly. We become dependent on others to determine our value.
But when we define our own arena, when we choose to show up authentically for ourselves,
Hmm.
that's when we reclaim our power.
I love how you put that. That's when we can step into our true potential and start living a more wholehearted life.
And that takes courage. It takes vulnerability to put yourself out there and pursue your dreams, knowing that you might fail.
For sure, there's always a risk involved. But think about it. The arena is where growth happens. It's where we develop resilience, learn from our mistakes, and become the best versions of ourselves.
So even if we stumble, even if things don't go exactly as planned, just the act of stepping into the arena is a victory in itself.
Absolutely. Because it shows that you're willing to put yourself out there, to embrace the uncertainty and risk that comes with growth. And that's what truly matters.
Wow, this is really shifting my perspective. It makes me think about all those times I held myself back from doing something I really wanted to do because I was afraid of what others might think or that I might fail.
We all have those moments. It's natural to feel fear. But the key is to recognize when fear is holding us back and to challenge ourselves to step outside of our comfort zones.
Because real growth, true transformation, happens outside of those comfortable, predictable spaces.
Right, and that discomfort, that vulnerability, is actually a sign that you're on the right track. It means you're stretching yourself, you're learning, you're evolving.
There's that Brené Brown quote that I just love. It goes, "Vulnerability is not weakness, it's our greatest measure of courage." I feel like that really sums up this whole conversation.
It does. It's such a powerful reminder that vulnerability isn't something to be ashamed of. It's something to be celebrated.
It's a sign that we're alive, engaged, and willing to put our whole hearts into living.
Exactly. And you know what's amazing? When we embrace vulnerability, it's not just about us. It impacts the people around us too.
Oh, yeah, totally. It's like a ripple effect, right?
Mm.
When you see someone being real and authentic, it gives you permission to do the same.
Exactly. Vulnerability is contagious. And it can be incredibly powerful in creating more compassionate and connected communities. So you know what? I'm curious.
What's that?
What's been the most impactful takeaway for you from this deep dive into daring greatly so far? What's really resonated with you?
That's a great question.
Dang.
Honestly, for me, it's been this whole idea that vulnerability is a practice. It's not like you just suddenly become a vulnerable person. It's something you work on every day.
Totally. It's like building a muscle. You got to keep flexing it to make it stronger. And it makes me think about vulnerability in the workplace.
Oh, yeah. How could we forget about work?
Right. It's like we're conditioned to think that vulnerability is a weakness, especially in professional settings.
Yeah, it's almost like you have to put on this mask of, like, I've got it all figured out, even when you're totally freaking out inside.
Exactly. And you know what? Brown actually argues that that kind of thinking can be super detrimental to a company's success.
Really? That's kind of surprising. I would think that projecting confidence would be, like, essential for leadership and stuff.
Well, it is to a certain extent, but Brown's research actually shows that when leaders are willing to show vulnerability, it creates a much more positive and productive work environment.
Okay, so how does that work? Like, how can being vulnerable actually make you a better leader?
Think about it. When a leader is willing to admit they don't have all the answers, it creates a sense of psychological safety for the whole team.
Psychological safety.
Yeah, it basically means that people feel comfortable speaking up, sharing their ideas, and even admitting mistakes without fear of being judged or punished.
Oh, I see. So it's like building a culture of trust where everyone feels like they can be themselves and contribute their unique perspective.
Precisely. And that's where the magic happens. When people feel safe to be vulnerable, they're more likely to take risks, innovate, and collaborate effectively.
Okay, that makes sense. But it's still hard to wrap my head around how you can be vulnerable at work without seeming incompetent or weak.
Right. It's a delicate balance, but it starts with small steps, like being willing to say, I don't know, or I need help. It also means being transparent about your own struggles and challenges.
So basically leading by example, showing your team that it's okay to not be perfect all the time.
Exactly. And when you do that, it gives other people permission to do the same. It creates a ripple effect of vulnerability that can transform the entire work culture.
That's amazing. I never thought about it that way. So by embracing vulnerability at work, we can actually unlock more creativity and innovation.
Absolutely. Because when people feel safe to be themselves, to take risks, and to learn from their mistakes, that's when the real breakthroughs happen.
Wow. This conversation has been so insightful. I feel like I have a whole new understanding of the power of vulnerability, not just in my personal life, but in every aspect of my
Me
life.
too. And I think that's one of the most important takeaways from Daring Greatly. It's not just a self-help book. It's a guide to living a more courageous and fulfilling life in all areas.
I couldn't agree more. So to wrap things up, is there anything else you would like to add? Any final thoughts for our listeners?
I guess I would just encourage everyone to pick up a copy of Daring Greatly and really spend some time with it. It's a book that will stay with you long after you finish reading it.
I second that.
Yeah.
It's a game changer, for sure. Well, that brings us to the end of another deep dive. Thanks for joining us today.
It was a pleasure.
And to all our listeners out there, remember, vulnerability is not a weakness. It's our greatest measure of courage. So go out there and dare greatly.